When you think of helmets in Warframe, you likely think of cosmetics, right? But what if I told you that helmets actually used to give you stat buffs? That's right, way back in the old days of Warframe, helmets acted similarly to corrupted mods, giving you a buff to a certain stat whilst reducing another. Alternate helmets did this since release, but one day they became unobtainable and new copies of the helmets no longer provided these buffs. But why did DE remove them? How did the community take this change, and what happened to the helmets already in existence? On January 29, 2013, alternate helmets were made available. They were acquired via alerts and purchasable directly from the market. These alternative helmets were accessible from your arsenal and originally increased a given stat while also reducing another. For example, the Arcane Gambit helmet for Vauban increases bullet jump velocity by 10% whilst reducing ability duration by 10%. Now, given today's standards, this is absolutely terrible, but believe it or not, it actually used to be worse. For the older Warframe players watching this video, you may remember stamina. Even just saying that word may have elicited some rather negative feelings. For newer players, like myself, it's almost impossible to imagine Warframe with limited mobility, considering how highly praised it is for that aspect. Like other movement systems, stamina was drained when you sprinted, and even when you used your melee weapon. The Gambit helmet, like mentioned earlier, used to increase your base stamina by a flat amount. This seems pretty nice on paper, but even by this point, July 13th, 2013, Warframe players had been finding workarounds to stamina. For example, the Dual Zoran is a set of dual axes, and their slide attack flung your Warframe forward. Combined with a well-timed jump, you could fling yourself across large distances, and this technique heavily outclassed any extra speed you would get from a stamina bonus. Other Arcane helmets, like the Excalibur Pendragon helmet, were actually quite good. The 5% armor reduction on it was virtually unnoticeable, and the 15% strength increase was super solid for being an external buff. The Arcane Aura helmet was also really good, increasing ability duration by 25% for a small 5% decrease to maximum health. This contrasts with helmets like the Gambit or Menticide, which were noticeably less useful. It's likely that the design philosophy for them was that even if players used the same builds, they could personalize their experience with small tweaks that didn't conflict with said builds. On September 14th, 2013, with Update 10, Shadows of the Dead, Necros got his own alternative helmet called the Arachnus helmet. Weirdly enough, this helmet didn't actually provide any stat buffs at all. Instead, it acted akin to that of helmets that we have today, purely cosmetic. Most players didn't really think much of this though. They just assumed that some helmets wouldn't provide stat buffs and proceeded normally. Strangely, despite the fact that the Arachnus helmet didn't buff any stats, it was still obtainable from alerts. By this point, DE had already stated that they want to keep items that are purely cosmetic on sale for plat or a direct currency only, so this was a little out of the ordinary. Regardless, everything else seemed pretty normal and not many players seemed to care, but the introduction of purely cosmetic helmets, like the Arachnus, hinted at a bigger change on the horizon, one that would alter the future of alternate helmets forever. On May 1st, 2014, DE Drew released a forum post that announced the removal of stats from alternate helmets. They detail some of the changes that would be occurring to these helmets, the most important of which being the creation of a new helmet type, and some reasons why, but we'll get to that later. Summarized, the change was basically that any helmets that are created before the hotfix would keep their stat buffs even after said hotfix. Following that, all helmets would be statless and purely cosmetic. So what happened to the helmets created before? Well, they had been recategorized into Arcane helmets. These are the helmets that most people are probably familiar with, and there are a limited number of them in existence, although this number is not known with certainty. Regarding the main reasons for removal, they basically stated that they felt stats on helmets would just be another thing to have to balance alongside weapons in the game. Drew states that, quote, Dev has commented that putting stats on helmets was not a decision they felt is right in the long term. We cannot make a definitive statement on the future of stats with cosmetic items, because ultimately, there are some players who still want stats, or other boosts/customizations to play a role with cosmetics, and there are other players who want cosmetics to remain purely cosmetic, unquote. I'm guessing they had a vision for helmets being strictly cosmetic and not interfering with gameplay. I understand it to that degree. It can be frustrating that you have to choose between having a cool cosmetic or having an optimized build, especially since the helmets took away from certain stats as well, which just makes it feel like a detriment if you want to look a certain way. Imagine you wanted to use the Ash Scorpion helmet because you thought it looked cool. Well, now you have to deal with a negative ability efficiency. With this change, DE provided players a choice to have helmets with stats, or one that's purely cosmetic. Arcane helmets are no longer obtainable by normal means, and are now only obtained through trading with other players. So, how did the community respond to this controversial change? As you might expect, opinions were divided. Now, while DE's strategy to phase out helmets with stats seems like a good idea, I personally feel like they could have gone about it a lot better. Essentially, they tried to please both players who valued their helmets that they put time and money into, while other players thought the idea of stats on helmets was just a bad idea. This kind of thing never works out, and it resulted in them leaving behind another piece of content that is still irrelevant in the game today. Taking to Reddit, it seems like people were split 50-50 with the concept. Some players argued that the removal of stats simplified the game and made it more accessible, while others felt it stripped away an interesting layer of customization. Some users were frustrated that DE didn't just add mod slots onto helmets, which is actually something Drew talked about in his post. He explains how, quote, "It's a great idea, and we've heard a lot of proposals for it. However, it requires time, commitment, testing, balance, and most importantly, it does not fit our current vision for cosmetic items. The goal of this change is to remove stats from helmets, not add more," unquote. But my only question is, if you wanted to focus on removing stats from helmets, why even bother keeping them in the game at all? I don't feel like creating a whole new set of helmets specifically because they were worried about players being upset was a good idea. This creates a fear of missing out, since you cannot obtain these helmets by normal means anymore, and while they are tradable, they are rather expensive. On Warframe Market, the prices for these helmets seem to hover around 300 to 500, even up to 700 platinum. There are also very few listings, so once they're bought out, players can sell them for however much they'd like to. People who have them get to be like, hey, I have this and you don't. This is quite literally the same reason Prime Chamber was so coveted. It didn't matter that it wasn't the best mod, hell, it didn't even matter if you used it. What mattered to collectors is that they had it and very few other people did. Assume DE did remove stats from all helmets in Warframe, there wouldn't be this fear of missing out, and they wouldn't be another piece of content that was borderline useless. Considering they take up an Arcane slot on your Warframe, I definitely wouldn't say they're worth using on most builds anyways. While it would have created some temporary unrest, the peace of mind would have far outweighed that wave of feedback. There's a Reddit user who perfectly sums up my opinion on the matter. A deleted user, whose name is apparently CJ, explains how, quote, "So, simply, keep the stat helmets or don't. It's that simple. Meeting halfway is silly. It's like DE is flipping off old players with one hand, power creep, and new players with the other, event exclusive weapons and mods, now this, thinking it's the wisest decision when they really could just be flipping off nobody," unquote. This perfectly highlights the current issue with Arcane helmets and where they still stand in the current meta after all this time. As unfortunate as it is, I'm pretty sure it'll stay like this forever. All in all, Arcane helmets were supposed to be a solution that would make both players new and old happy, but in reality, they just became a relic from bygone days. Assume you could equip them with 2 Arcanes, they'd be too OP. If they just removed them altogether, it would have made everything a lot simpler and they'd only have to sustain some temporary fallout. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. It was refreshing to work on another history style video, so let me know if you enjoyed it by liking and subscribing to the channel. It helps out a lot. What do you think about Arcane helmets? Should DE have removed them entirely, or was meeting halfway the right call? Let me know in the comments below. As always, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Later.